All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling this news story that's really got everyone buzzing. I mean, even right after a ceasefire in the region, President Trump is out with this proposal on the Gaza Strip.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people are talking about it for sure.
Yeah, you guys sent in tons of articles about it from all sorts of different perspectives, and let me tell you, this proposal is causing quite a stir around the world.
I can imagine.
So, what exactly is Trump proposing? And what are the potential implications?
Well, the really interesting thing here is Trump isn't holding back at all.
Yeah.
He's straight up talking about the U.S. taking over Gaza,
Wow.
and he's using strong language like own it and even level it.
Level it.
Yeah. And then he paints this picture of a Riviera of the Middle East, which on the surface sounds, appealing.
Yeah, right.
But given the situation on the ground, it brings up a lot of questions.
It really does. It's bold, to say the least. From the articles, some key points really jumped out at me. Dismantling all the weapons there. Completely leveling the entire area.
Wow.
And then rebuilding with a focus on bringing in businesses and encouraging people from all over the world to move in.
That's quite the plan.
It's radical. Has
Yeah.
anything like this ever even been attempted before?
Well, there are definitely some historical parallels you can draw, but nothing on this scale in recent history, for sure.
I can't imagine.
Just the logistics alone of leveling
Yeah.
and then rebuilding an area as populated as Gaza are mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And then you have the legal side of things, too. You're talking about a territory that's very densely populated with a complicated history and its own government already. The idea of one country just coming in and taking over raises a ton of questions about, sovereignty and international law.
Yeah, it's not like buying a piece of land and just doing whatever you want with it, is it?
Not quite, no.
And we can't ignore the money either.
Of course.
Rebuilding an entire region from the ground up would be astronomically expensive.
Absolutely.
Even if the U.S. were to fit the bill, where would that money even come from? Yeah.
What would the long-term economic impact be?
You've got it. Those costs wouldn't just be for the buildings themselves. You'd have to think about infrastructure, social services, security. The list goes on.
Oh, I see.
Plus, you'd have to consider the potential for economic disruption in the region. Is this something the U.S. is really ready to invest in, not just financially, but in terms of a long-term commitment?
That's a great point. Okay, let's say hypothetically the money and the logistics are somehow figured out. What about the people who already live in Gaza? Where do they fit into this vision of a Riviera?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated.
I bet.
Some articles suggest that Trump sees this as Palestinians not coming back to Gaza.
Really?
But then others quote him talking about Palestinians living in this new rebuilt area. It's a contradiction that has a lot of people worried about what will happen to them. Where would they go? What would happen to their homes and their communities? These are questions that the proposal doesn't really address.
It sounds like a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of potential for things to go wrong.
No wonder there are such strong reactions from around the world.
Absolutely. The articles mentioned Saudi Arabia came out strong, reiterating that they are firmly against displacing Palestinians, and Hamas called Trump's remarks ridiculous and absurd.
Yeah.
These are major players in the region, and their opposition could be a serious roadblock.
Then you have Netanyahu, who seemed more open to exploring the idea when he met with Trump. But even he was pretty careful, emphasizing the need to think it through very carefully. What's your take on his more cautious response?
Well, you have to remember that Netanyahu has his own political situation to think about. He needs to balance his relationship with the U.S. with all the complexities of what's happening in Gaza. His response, I think, shows a certain amount of pragmatism. He's not outright rejecting the proposal, but he's not fully on board with it either.
Yeah.
It seems like a calculated move, probably aimed at keeping the door open for negotiations while also managing expectations.
So we've got this incredibly ambitious and controversial proposal, and the reactions are all over the place, from cautious interest to flat-out rejection. It's pretty clear this is going to have a big impact on the peace process, which is already pretty fragile. Can you talk more about the potential ramifications here?
One big concern is that this could make things even more tense in the region and maybe even lead to more violence. Trump's proposal seems to ignore the current framework for peace negotiations and could undermine years of work that's been done to find a solution. There's a real risk that this could backfire and make a peaceful resolution even harder to achieve.
That's a scary thought. It sounds like this proposal, no matter what the intention behind it, has the potential to create more problems than it solves. And what about the comparisons being made between Trump's approach and how former President Biden handled things?
It's pretty interesting to contrast their approaches, actually.
Right.
Biden, played a key role in those negotiations for the recent ceasefire and the hostage release.
Yeah.
He was all about diplomacy, working with international partners.
Yeah, the articles highlighted how everyone seemed to be cooperating.
Exactly. And he got praise from both Netanyahu and Hamas for what he did.
That's right. And now we've got Trump, who's taking this much more unilateral approach, some might even say confrontational.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, is this just Trump trying to undo everything Biden accomplished during his term? It seems to be a pattern.
It's a good point to make. This isn't the first time we've seen Trump, making these big pronouncements on the world stage that seem to contradict or overturn what was done before.
Right.
And it creates this feeling of uncertainty for everyone involved, allies and adversaries alike. When U.S. foreign policy seems inconsistent, it can really destabilize things globally.
It makes you wonder what the long-term effects will be, not just for this specific situation, but for America's place in the world.
For sure.
But let's stick with the immediate reactions for now. The articles mention that there's even pushback from within Trump's own administration. It seems some top aides knew about the Gaza proposal before Netanyahu's visit, but it's not clear if everyone was on board. What could this internal disagreement mean for the proposal going forward?
Well, if there's enough internal dissent, that could be a major roadblock.
Yeah.
It could signal that support for Trump's agenda is weakening and maybe even lead to challenges from within his own party.
You think so?
It's one thing to throw out a bold idea, but it's another thing entirely to get the support you need to actually make it happen.
That's true. This is starting to look like a real political earthquake, shaking things up, both here and abroad.
Yeah.
It reminds me of when Trump talked about buying Greenland.
Oh, yeah.
Another one of those bold, unexpected ideas that ultimately went nowhere.
Yeah. Is this a pattern with Trump? Grand pronouncements that grab headlines but then fizzle out when it comes to actually doing them.
It seems that way.
It does seem like there's a tendency to float these big ideas without having a clear plan for how to actually put them into action.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what's the real motivation here? Is it about publicity? Is it about distracting from other issues? Is it about appealing to a certain group of supporters? It's tough to say for sure, but it's something to keep in mind, especially with an election coming up, right? Could this Gaza proposal be a way to rally support or get his base energized?
It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
We've seen how Trump uses foreign policy to appeal to his supporters and present himself as a strong, decisive leader. This could be another attempt to do just that, boost his image and solidify his base.
So much to think about.
I know, right?
It's clear the situation has so many layers of complexity.
Absolutely.
And we haven't even gotten to the most important part.
Yeah.
What does all of this mean for the people actually living in Gaza?
That's the question that shouldn't get lost in all the political back and forth. Their voices and their perspectives are often ignored, but they're the ones who will be most affected by any decisions that are made about Gaza's future. It's true, the articles paint a pretty bleak picture of life there right now. Widespread poverty, limited access to basic things, the constant threat of violence.
Yeah, it's rough.
It's hard to imagine how this proposal, even with the promises of economic opportunity, would actually improve their lives.
Especially when you think about the very real concerns about people being forced to leave their homes.
Right.
Even if this Riviera idea were to actually happen,
Right.
who would be allowed to live there? Would Palestinians have the right to return to their land? Would they have any say in how this new Gaza is built and governed? These are all crucial questions that need answers.
It's easy to get caught up in all the political drama, but we can't forget about the human cost of all of this.
Absolutely. Behind the headlines and the political speeches, there are real people whose lives are being deeply impacted by this.
Right.
It's important to listen to their stories, understand what they're going through, and make sure that any solutions put their well-being and their rights first.
Well said. And it's not just about the present, it's about the future, too. What kind of legacy will this proposal leave behind? Will it help create a more peaceful and prosperous future for Gaza? Or will it just make existing tensions worse and create new problems?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The way forward is unclear, and there's a lot at stake.
Yeah.
This is a defining moment for sure, one that will shape the future of Gaza and the whole Middle East for years to come.
We'll definitely be keeping an eye on it now before we wrap up. I wanted to touch on one more thing from the articles.
Okay.
They kept bringing up these comparisons between Trump and how former President Biden handled the situation.
Right.
Yeah, their approaches really couldn't be more different, could they?
It's pretty stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Biden was all about de-escalation,
Yeah.
building trust, working within the existing, framework of international diplomacy.
Right.
And this proposal from Trump, well, it seems to just throw all of that out the window.
Yeah, it really does.
And it raises questions about, the consistency and predictability of U.S. foreign policy.
It makes you wonder what our allies are thinking right now, and our adversaries for that matter.
Exact.
So is this just a political stunt? Or is there a real chance this proposal could actually gain some traction?
Well, when you consider how strongly some key players have come out against it,
Like who?
well, Saudi Arabia, Hamas, even some people within Trump's own administration,
Right.
it seems pretty unlikely that this will actually happen. I mean, it would take a huge shift in the global political landscape and a level of international cooperation that's hard to imagine right now.
So if Trump's plan probably won't go anywhere, what other options are there? What can be done to address what's happening in Gaza and find a way to create a lasting peace?
That's the question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers.
I imagine not.
It's a really complex issue with deep historical roots and a long history of attempts at resolution that just haven't worked.
Right.
But maybe this proposal, as controversial as it is, can be a starting point for a new conversation.
How so?
It's forcing us to confront the fact that we need a different approach, one that moves beyond the same old arguments and looks for truly innovative solutions.
So what would that look like?
It would require a real commitment to diplomacy,
Okay.
a recognition of the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
and a willingness to address the needs and aspirations of both Palestinians and Israelis.
I see.
It would mean finding ways to build trust, create economic opportunities, and make sure everyone feels safe and secure.
That's a tall order.
It is, but it's the only way forward.
So where do we go from here? We've looked at this controversial proposal, analyzed the reactions, talked about the potential consequences. What's the key takeaway for our listener today?
Well, you've certainly been given a lot to think about, but here's a final thought for you, that this proposal, whether it ultimately succeeds or fails, highlights just how urgently we need creative solutions to this conflict that's been going on in Gaza for so long. The way things are right now just isn't sustainable. The challenge and the opportunity is to find a new path forward, one that leads to a future that's more just and more peaceful for everyone involved.
Well said. Thanks for breaking all of this down for us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in to another deep dive. Catch you next time.